Welcome back once again to the Fantasy Points Friday Night Hype Show. I'm your host, Matt Donnelly, and it is time to get hyped for this weekend's slate of games. Each and every week, we are going to break down 4 games that I'm excited about. We're going to talk about some injuries so you don't get left out there ahead of those lineup decisions that you need to make, because we're here at Fantasy Points to help you score more. We want to help you help yourselves to those fantasy championships. This week, we are going to preview the Los Angeles Chargers versus the Atlanta Falcons. Yes, we're going to talk about the Dirty Bird here. We're going to talk about the Green Bay Packers versus the Detroit Lions, the Minnesota Vikings and the Washington Commanders, and of course, the Miami Dolphins and the Bears from Chicago. But first, before we get into the week's slate of games here, let's talk about some of these injuries, because there are injuries all over the map right now. And what can you possibly expect? Now, the 49ers, they're on bye, so Deebo Samuel, expect him back in week number 10. Keenan Allen, he showed up on the injury report again with that hamstring injury. He probably should have played back in week number 7. Now we don't know when he's going to be back. Chuba Hubbard, look for him to possibly come back here in week 9 or possibly in week 10. Some other guys to keep an eye on here the rest of this week. Jahan Dotson. Michael Thomas, you don't have to worry about that now. He is now on the IR. James Conner with that rib injury, he could come back this week as well. Darren Waller, Cordell Patterson, keep an eye on that injury report. He could be activated from the IR. We've got Ezekiel Elliott there on the bye. Alan Lazard dealing with that shoulder injury. He is probably not playing again this week. Treylon Burks, he's potentially coming off the IR here in week number 10, 11. Some other guys to keep an eye on here. Randall Cobb, Gus Edwards for the Baltimore Ravens. I'm not expecting him to play either this week, as he's dealing with a little bit of something there. Nico Collins, you saw that on Thursday Night Football. He was ruled out. He's been dealing with a groin injury. I would not be expecting him back next week, depending on what he's dealing with, as well as Brandon Cooks and dealing with his emotions. We also have Jamar Chase there. He's probably out for the next, 4 weeks or so bank on about a week 13 return there. Jameson Williams, he's ready to return probably in week 12 or week 13 himself. Mike Williams, he's dealing with that ankle injury. You look for weeks 11 through 13 for him to return. And then, of course, some of these other ones. Rashad Bateman, we got news today that foot injury is going to keep him out the rest of the season. And Buyer, get ready, because we could have an Odell Beckham Jr. return here in weeks 14 through 16, somewhere in that period. And we've also got that other injury there in Minnesota there that brought TJ Hawkinson to the Minnesota Vikings, and that is the high ankle sprain that put Irv Smith Jr. on the IR, and it's probably going to keep him out for the next 8 to 10 weeks. Now, all that information, you can head over to fantasypoints.com or check out Edwin Porras there on Twitter. He's there to help you with these injuries and kind of decipher things from a medical background. Now, heading into the games that we're not going to talk about this week, we've got the Carolina Panthers and the Cincinnati Bengals. Cat fight! Brian Burns versus Joe Burrow. Burrow, he's been sacked 29 times this season alone. And since 2021, playoffs included, he's been sacked 99 times. So sacks, he's got 99 problems, and sacks are definitely one of them. Now, Brian Burns, he's got himself 5 sacks already this season for the Panthers. Las Vegas Raiders at the Jacksonville Jaguars. As a Raiders fan, I can't, right? I just can't. I'm not prepared emotionally to talk about this game. Next! Now, we got the Indianapolis Colts and the New England Patriots. Quick, which 2 players this season have 500 yards rushing and 200 yards receiving? Time's up. How about Christian McCaffrey and Ramondre Stevenson? Beep, 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 beep. Yes, I bet you were expecting me to say Jonathan Taylor. Keep an eye on his injury report, because he may not be able to participate either this week. Deion Jackson may get his time to shine once again. Buffalo at the New York Jets. Sauce Gardner and DJ Reed versus Stephon Diggs and Gabriel Davis. You know I love matchups inside the matchups. I love those cornerbacks versus the wide receivers. These Jets DBs, they have been excellent all season. Perhaps top 5 in their own rights individually. Now, Davis has the highest yards per reception total there, 26.1 since 1990, while Diggs is 7 touchdowns this season. That's more touchdowns than the Steelers, the Broncos, the Giants, and yes, the Texans there heading into week number 9. Seattle at Arizona. DeAndre Hopkins, he became the 5th fastest player to record 800 receptions, doing it in just 138 games. Meanwhile, on the other sideline there, we have Geno Smith, who simply doesn't miss with the Seahawks, sitting 3rd in pass rating at 107.2, and he is tops in completion percentage and deep ball completion percentage there in the league. Fun fact, in 7 NFL seasons, Smith has only had multiple touchdown games in 7 contests. This year alone, he has done it 6 times. Now, Los Angeles Rams at the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Last season, Brady was averaging 2 touchdowns in the first half of contests. This season, he has just 2 touchdowns in all his first halves combined. That's 8 games. Hey, Stafford, stop it. Stafford, you haven't been any better. Now, Tennessee Titans at the Kansas City Chiefs. Titans forever. Henry's 6 games of more than 200 yards rushing and 2 touchdowns are the most since 1950. Heck, he's done that to the Texans 4 times alone, while LaDainian Tomlinson happens to be next on that list, and he's accomplished that feat only 3 times. Henry will need to control the clock this week against the Chiefs and try and keep Patrick Mahomes and company off the field. Monday Night Football, Baltimore Ravens, New Orleans Saints. Is Andy Dalton basically the Bayou version of Geno Smith? Will Michael Thomas or Jarvis Landry even play again here in 2022? Well, the answer to Michael Thomas is no. Jarvis Landry, what say you? And how did the NFL allow the Baltimore Ravens to add Roquan Smith? I need answers to these questions right now. Now, on buys, I can tell you who's on buys. The Cleveland Browns, the Dallas Cowboys, the Denver Broncos, the New York Giants, the Pittsburgh Steelers, and the San Francisco 49ers. This is one of the toughest bye weeks to deal with outside of perhaps week number 14 there. Yes, that's when your playoffs start and players are on buys. Now let's dive into some of these games that I'm excited for this week, starting with the Los Angeles Chargers at the Atlanta Falcons. We have a first-place team in their division taking on a second-place team in their respective division, and it's not exactly who you would have thought about at the beginning of the season. Yes, if you would have predicted that the Atlanta Falcons would be first place in the NFC South through 8 weeks, you'd be a liar. I'm telling you right now, there's no way you would have predicted it, especially the way that Arthur Smith and this team have been getting it done. But first, we are going to talk about the Los Angeles Chargers. Fantasy Points' very own Jake Tribby there said it best. Eckler is giving you mid-range wide receiver 2 production and 12 carries per contest. Eckler has 15.2 fantasy points per game as a receiver and is averaging more receiving fantasy points per game than Mike Williams, Deebo Samuel, Amari Cooper, CeeDee Lamb, T. Higgins, Adam Thielen, Cortland Sutton, Chris Godwin. We can probably throw a few more names out there. Now imagine what kind of fantasy production he would be capable of if the Chargers actually gave him the ball within the 5-yard line. That being said, keep an eye on him in the injury reports here leading up to this contest because he popped up with an abdomen injury that limited him back on Thursday. Eckler, he sits 4th in the NFL behind Tyreek Hill, Cooper Kupp, and Stephon Diggs with his 53 receptions. Yes, 4th amongst all pass catchers, not just running backs here, all pass catchers. Now, sure, it's production born out of necessity as the Chargers. They haven't had Keenan Allen and or Mike Williams in their lineup at the same time and healthy since week number 1? Then again, when you have a player who has 435 yards after the catch this season, you simply have to find ways to get the ball into his hands. That's what good coaching does. See, coaching, it's actually pretty easy. Get the ball into good players' hands. As for Joshua Palmer, we were all expecting big things from him coming to this season. Now, I'm not about to quiet quit him like some other wide receivers, but filling in for Keenan Allen wasn't exactly what he was built to do. But he is an adequate replacement for Mike Williams over the next few weeks. If Austin Eckler goes out on the radio show and on fantasy radio shows and tells you to pick up Joshua Palmer, you have to pick him up for your fantasy squads. He's literally the guy who told you to pick up Justin Jackson against the Houston Texans last season when Justin Jackson went bananas. Now, on Wednesday, Coach Staley said that Keenan Allen's hamstring will not practice today, and it's possible that he could miss Sunday's game against his Falcons team. He would also add that the injury has not responded the way that we would hope. How do you hurt yourself on your bye week? How do you get hurt on your day off? Now, me personally, I totally get it there. I'm not going to age shame anyone by anyone's stretch of anyone's imagination. I'm at that age right now in my life where if I sneeze, I can either be out day to day or head on to the IR. Now, the Falcons, they are giving up the 3rd most fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks this season at 25.3. The most passing yards per game there at 306.9. And the 3rd most yards per pass attempt at 7.7. And heck, you know what? How about the 6th most passing touchdowns per game at 1.8? So you have to think that Justin Herbert is back this week. Yeah, I'm thinking I'm back. Now, for the Atlanta Falcons, free Calvin Ridley. That's what Cordell Patterson's shirt said on the sideline there last week. And the Falcons, hey, they say if you love something, you set it free. Well, they set Calvin Ridley free, sending him to Duval County in a deal that involves a complicated compensatory type formula there. Now, watching this Arthur Smith coach team, even if Ridley was available, they would have let him return to this team. He's one more pass catcher who's not going to be able to catch passes. Now, game script has no effect on how the Falcons run their offense. Whether they are tied, trailing, or leading, they still rank 30th or worse when it comes to passing. Arthur Smith, he doesn't care about your football teams. All he's worried about doing is winning. It's easy to call for Smith's job considering the Falcons used 2 top 10 selections these past 2 seasons there, and Kyle Pitts there and Drake London to basically watch them essentially block. But you can't argue the success that this team has had despite the lack of talent surrounding the rest of this roster. Now, looking for the Falcons offense as a whole, they are top 12 in both scoring drive percentage and touchdown drive percentage this season, thanks in large part to that run game. Atlanta has averaged 158.1 yards per contest so far this season on the ground, and they're doing it with guys like Caleb Huntley, Tyler Algier, and Avery Williams ever since Cordell Patterson found himself on the IR a few weeks back. Now, by the way, I kind of mentioned this earlier in the injury rundown. He is set to come back. He is eligible to come off that IR list, and if he's ready to come back, you could probably put him in your lineup this week in this contest. The Falcons also sit 6th in points per game, averaging 25 points per game this season, and are 14th in yards per play at 5.5. Now, per Joe Dolan there and the Fantasy Points data team there, in this week's mismatch report, the Chargers defense has been really bad. Over the last 5 weeks, only the Chiefs have allowed more fantasy points above average to running backs than what the Chargers have. All of Ken Walker there and Nick Chubb and Damian Pierce, they have all ran for over 100 yards and a touchdown in that span, with Chubb and Walker double dipping. Now, the Chargers' run defense is almost as bad as the Texans' run defense, as the Chargers are allowing the second most fantasy points on a per-game basis there at 29.2. I mentioned Cordell Patterson potentially returning. He automatically becomes into that RB1 conversation. But let's not discount the discount version of Justin Fields here in Marcus Mariota, as he has produced the 5th most fantasy points at the quarterback position since week number 5. Now, it helps when you have a couple stud second-level blockers in Kyle Pitts and Drake London to help you fully achieve that full Konami code ability. Now, the next game on our docket, we're going to talk about the Green Bay Packers and the Detroit Lions. For Green Bay, Aaron Rodgers is desperate to get Allen Lazard back in the offense, and I don't think it's going to happen this week. Now, sure, Romeo Doubs there was serviceable last week, 62 yards and a score against the Bills, but this Packers offense, it has looked out of sorts all season long. If they can't take advantage of this Lions secondary, the one that's allowed 1,939 passing yards so far this season, with opposing wide receivers being responsible for 1,338 of those, that's the 5th most in the league, I'm not even sure what to tell you anymore. Now, I really feel for Packers fans there. Randall Cobb, Allen Lazard, they were both out last week. Potentially both are going to be out again this week. Sammy Watkins, by the way, never Sammy, and Christian Watson have been battling and sidelined all season long. And yet, as the trade line came and gone, the Packers did nothing, absolutely nothing to resolve this issue at the position. Now, the matchup inside the matchup this week, if Allen Lazard is ready to go, he gets either A.J. Parker or Amani or Warrior there. And Lazard, he runs 36% of his routes from the slot and 33% of them from the right side of the formation, which means 70 or so percent of his routes are going to, if he's healthy, will be against A.J. Parker in the slot or a Warrior there on the outside. Both have given up top 3 numbers when it comes to PPR fantasy points per route run over the last 5 weeks there. And again, that is per the fantasypoints.com mismatch report. If Rodgers is left without a dance partner yet again to throw the ball to, he may be forced to recite a little Shakespeare. Romeo, Romeo, where art thou, Romeo? Dobbs has seen an 18.1% target share this season, has accounted for 22.7% of the Packers' air yards. Over the last few weeks, though, Detroit, they've been showing a little bit more zone than they normally do there. And Dobbs on the season has seen 57% of his total targets coming against zone coverages. Well, I mean, at least the Packers, they've kind of figured out this run game, right? I mean, they got this whole A.J. Dillon and Aaron Jones thing figured out. Against the Bills last week, Jones had 20 carries for 143 yards, which works out to about 7.2 yards per carry against one of the better run defenses in the league. He would also have 4 receptions after recording 9 the week prior. As for Dillon, he would average a very healthy 5.4 yards per carry on his 10 attempts. Now, Jones this week is a solid RB1, and Dillon, he can be put in your flex there. If you're looking for a little bit of a flexual healing, this matchup against Detroit may be able to get that job done for you. Now, Detroit is a fantastic matchup for opposing backs, allowing the fourth most fantasy points per game at 27.7 and the second highest percentage of explosive plays, 8.1%. And heck, even the highest touchdown rate there at 6.5% to running backs. Now, for the Detroit Lions there in this offense, you have to love Dan Campbell. This week, he gave us a little bit of insight on what we could potentially see. First, regarding DeAndre Swift there, we probably gave Swift one too many carries last week. We love Swift, glad he's out there, but he's not back, which is not a bad thing according to Fantasy Points Edwin Porras there. Rehab games in sports, rehab is a concept used primarily to pressure test how a rehabbing athlete will hold up in a game environment. Volume, reps are usually predetermined and impossible to predict for fantasy purposes. If for some reason DeAndre Swift is a no-go this week, and you know what, I can see this possibly happening because the Lions have been cautious with him throughout the week, throughout these practices here, then Jamal Williams enters that RB1 conversation yet again, and Craig Reynolds could perhaps carry himself a little fantasy flex appeal himself for those desperate managers. Now, Craig Reynolds, he may not be a 10, but to someone this week, he could be a solid 6. On the Hawkinson trade, again, Dan Campbell, there's more food on the table now for the other skilled players on this offense. It looks as though Amon-Ra St. Brown better pony up to the table in his stretchy pants there because he is going to be eaten. You know the pants I'm talking about. Hey, we all have these ones. The ones we pull out for Thanksgiving as we get up there, one nice little elastic band. Yeah, those are the ones that Amon-Ra St. Brown needs from now on. Now, let's see how the table sets up for him this week. We know regardless of Swift's injury designation, the Lions will be getting him involved in the pass game. They're going to throttle him back in the run game, as evidenced by his 5 carries and his 60% route participation in his return last week. Meaning, again, it appears as though Swift and Jamal Williams, if Swift is available, are going to coexist as flex options, which would also kill the value of Craig Reynolds. Now, on one of my primetime previews featuring the Bills, I talked about Gabriel Davis and what he's capable of doing when he is healthy and in your lineup. Well, you could say the same thing about St. Brown. Per Graham Barfield stat pack there. In his last 10 healthy games that he has played in, at least 65% of the snaps, Amon-Ra St. Brown has tallied 81 receptions, 882 yards, and 8 touchdowns on 110 targets. He has had 9+ targets, 6+ receptions, and 60+ yards in each and every game in that span, averaging 21.7 fantasy points per game in those 10 healthy contests, which would make him the wide receiver 5 over someone like Justin Jefferson, who's been averaging 20.8 fantasy points this season. Now, speaking of Justin Jefferson, we're going to talk about the Minnesota Vikings and the Washington Commanders, and you know Jefferson's name is going to get brought up here. Just not right now. Now, the Vikings, they acquired tight end TJ Hawkinson from their division rival Detroit Lions here this past trade deadline, and nobody saw that coming either. You just don't trade within the division. That doesn't happen these days. Now, Minnesota, they had to do something after they learned that they lost Irv Smith Jr. yet again, likely for the entire season there, 8 to 10 weeks, whatever you want to call that there. And right now, there's no one standing their path here in the NFC North. The way this is breaking down from, there is no one to challenge them. So they must feel pretty good about any kind of playoff push that they could put forth. The Vikings now roster 2 of the 3 players this season that have surpassed 175 receiving yards in a single contest, with TJ Hawkinson and Justin Jefferson out there catching passes. The other player, Tyreek Hill, who not only has caught 175 yards in one game, he's caught at least 160 yards receiving in 4 separate occasions this season. That's how good Tyreek Hill has been. More on him later on in the show. Now, Kirk Cousins, he doesn't just like it. He loves it. For one, Minnesota has only gone 270 receiving yards this season from that tight end position. Meanwhile, Hawkinson has accumulated 395 yards with the Lions prior to that trade. We also have to keep this little streak going there for that Kirk Cousins is currently on, having thrown for at least 1 touchdown in his last 37 contests. The next closest streak as far as consecutive games with a touchdown pass, that actually belongs to Jimmy Garoppolo, who's thrown a touchdown pass in 16 straight games. Now, I'm expecting the Vikings to throw plenty this week. 1, because Washington, they can't stop the pass. And 2, if I can avoid running the ball at Deron Payne, Jonathan Allen, and Montez Sweat, I'm probably going to do that. That said, if Dalvin Cook can get into that second and third level of this Washington Commanders defense, the yardage is going to start adding up in a hurry, as the Commanders, they have struggled, and I mean this in the most liberal sense possible, they have struggled with their tackling all season long. Now, Washington, they are allowing 26.41 fantasy points per game to receivers this season, and you just know that Justin Jefferson is about to put on a show this week out there and bust out a gritty, or probably 2. Now, Washington, how good has Terry McLaurin been? I mean, how good could Terry McLaurin be if he had a quarterback? But how good has he been? Last week, he went for 113 yards, including that last-minute 42-yard reception to get the Commanders inside the 5 to kick that game-winning field goal. McLaurin seems to have found something with Tyler Heinicke there, as his fantasy production with that quarterback under center happens to be better than with any other quarterback that this Washington team has put under center in recent memory. Then again, that bar, it's set pretty low. I mean, if you set that bar low enough, every once in a while you trip over it and people praise you for it. I mean, that's what I kind of feel like what's happening there in Washington. The Vikings are allowing the 7th most fantasy points to receivers this season, and they have been going up on an average of 38.01 per contest. Hopefully, the Commanders are going to have Jahan Dotson back in their lineup this week after he's missed the past several weeks with that hamstring injury. Certainly an injury worth monitoring as we get closer and closer to kickoff this week. Dotson has missed the last 4 games there, and he still leads his Commanders team with 4 receiving touchdowns, as he was Carson Wentz's first read down in the red zone. Now, remember when Antonio Gibson was as good as done? That may have been a bit of an exaggeration there. It may have been a little premature, if I may. Last week, Brian Robinson saw only 25% of a snapshot there and had 1 more carry than Antonio Gibson had had. It probably doesn't help when you've been held to 3.7 yards per carry or less in all 4 games. And Gibson is out there busting 18-yard receptions and showing that he is the more explosive of the 2 backs. Minnesota is allowing the 3rd fewest yards per carry, stopping the run and holding ball carriers to about 3.83 yards per attempt. Against the Colts last week, Gibson had 7 receptions for 58 yards and a score, while also receiving 7 carries. If you look at the Commanders' backfield splits the last 2 weeks, Robinson has a slight edge over Gibson there in rushing attempts, seeing 41.5% of them to Gibson's 26.2%. While Gibson and McKissick are seeing 17.7 and 11.3% of the target share versus Robinson's 3.2, and both backs have run route percentages over 30%, while Robinson he's been doing this less than 9% of the time. But the biggest stat of note here is that Gibson, not Robinson, leads the backs here in Washington with 7 red zone opportunities. You add that all up, bip, boppity, boo, and put the fact that this could be a blowout for the Vikings, in which the game script says, hey, we need a back who can catch the ball. I'm not feeling Brian Robinson this week. And finally, the last game of the week. Welcome to Miami. Welcome to the Monsters of the Midway. We have the Miami Dolphins and the Chicago Bears getting it on there in Soldier Field in Chicago. Perhaps you were expecting me to talk about the Tennessee Titans versus the Kansas City Chiefs under the primetime lights in Arrowhead, or even Seattle in the desert to face the Cardinals, or perhaps the Rams in Tampa Bay to take on Brady and the Bucs. But Miami and Chicago? Well, it may not look great on paper, but this game has the potential to be incredibly fun and high scoring for fantasy purposes. Let's take a look, shall we? Now, Miami, this team became even more dangerous on both sides of the ball after acquiring Bradley Chubb from the Broncos and reunited Jeffrey Wilson with Raheem Mostert there in this Dolphins backfield. Expect Wilson to be basically ready to go this week, having played in that Mike McDaniel offense last year in San Francisco. Now, I guess we can officially look back at how this trade for the Dolphins and the San Francisco 49ers took place, in which the 49ers acquired Trey Lance a few seasons ago there, and Miami got 3 first-round picks, in which they basically turned those into Tyreek Hill, more on him in a minute, Jalen Waddle, and Bradley Chubb. Now, that's what I call a pretty solid return of your investment. Now, before we talk about the historic pace that these receivers for the Dolphins are setting, let's talk about the man pulling the trigger under center. Per Graham Barfield's stat pack there over on fantasypoints.com, Tua Tagovailoa has the 4th best completion rate over expectation, the 2nd best in passer rating, and the 3rd best fantasy points per dropback, only behind Josh Allen and Patrick Mahomes. It helps when you throw a catchable ball there, which leads to about 86.6% there, to go along with a 112.7 passer rating, leading the league in both those categories. Now, for those pass catches. I mean, it's easy to complete passes and throw catchable balls when you're throwing to Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle. Let's be honest about that. Now, Hill and Waddle have combined for 1,698 receiving yards so far this season, which is the most in the Super Bowl era by any team in NFL history through the first 8 weeks of the season. The next closest pass-catching duo in terms of yardage this season is the Bills duo of Diggs and Davis, who have combined for 1,182 yards. Tyreek Hill, his 961 yards, that sits as the 3rd most over that 8-game stretch in NFL history, behind Torrey Holt at 978 yards there in 2003, and Marvin Harrison's 862 yards back in 2000. Hill is literally right now on pace for 2,042 yards. I did the math. Trust me, it checks out. Fun fact, of Waddle's 42 receptions this season, 24 of them have resulted in either a first down or a touchdown. That's about 81%, give or take. Again, I'm no genius when it comes to numbers and things. That is, though, the highest percentage in the National Football League. Now, for the Chicago Bears, hey, you got your work cut out for you, but hey, we got some pieces to work with here. We have some excitement in this team. Justin Fields is the QB2. Yes, I spoke slowly there so you can understand the ramifications of that in total fantasy points. And he's also the QB6 in terms of fantasy points per game, according to Scott Barrett of fantasypoints.com over the last 4 weeks, including a couple top 5 finishes the last couple weeks. And this week he faces a Dolphins defense that is the 7th worst against opposing quarterbacks this season, as the Dolphins are surrendering 19.74 fantasy points per game. It helps when you have that Konami code ability and you are averaging 69.2 yards per game on the ground, which is also tops amongst quarterbacks and would actually rank inside the top 20 if he was a running back. Now, Miami, they have allowed the 4th most passing yards to date at 2,181, which sits only behind Atlanta, Pittsburgh, and Baltimore so far, while also allowing the 5th most rushing yards to quarterbacks with 192 so far through week number 8. Now, the last time that the Bears had this kind of success on the ground, you have to go all the way back to 1968 when Gale Sayers was out there carrying the rock for the Bears. Chicago has 200 or more rushing yards in 3 straight contests, and they are averaging 188.4 yards per game here in 2022. Miami has only allowed 568 yards, 2 backs this season on the ground, but they sit 18th in fantasy points against this season, allowing 23.18 per contest. Khalil Herbert is one of the reasons, along with, Justin Fields and David Montgomery, as to why this run game has been so successful. Herbert's yards per carry average is 6.2 yards. That sits atop the NFL alongside Tony Pollard there and Travis Etienne. When you look at potentially elite receivers that have kind of been held back by the quarterback, you think of Amari Cooper, perhaps Chris Olave, and how about Darnell Mooney? I mean, these guys have to be right there in consideration. However, Mooney is the only receiver in the NFL with a 40+% air yard share there, with less than 30 receptions and 0 touchdowns per Chris Weck there on the Fantasy Points data team. You can go check out his tweet there. Now, let's hope the addition of Chase Claypool, who they got from the Pittsburgh Steelers for his 2nd-round selection, pays off moving forward and opens up this passing game a little bit more. If you want more, we got more here in the outro, but I want to hear from you. You've heard from me. You've heard what games I'm interested in. You hear what's got me hyped. What are the headlines? What are the matchups? What has you hyped for week number 9? And if you are hyped for fantasy points, if you are hyped to score more, how about use promo code HYPE22 for 10% off your fantasy point subscription today? You want college football? You want DFS? You want the NFL? You want fantasy football? We have you covered. But before I head off here right now, here's some of the rundowns of the shows on the YouTube channel. They're taking place throughout the week. Monday grades with Wes Huber. That's coming at you at 9 a.m. Eastern on Mondays. Tuesdays, we have Plugged In with DFS Review there with Scott Barrett and JM2 Win at 2 p.m. Eastern. Wednesdays, the midweek mailbag with Nick Script. And every Tuesday through Friday, have a cup of Joe with Joe Dolan at 9 a.m. Eastern with the daily lineup. You do not want to miss that. I promise you that. And if you want to score more, you need to make sure you're tuning into the Friday Night Hype Show every Friday right here on the Fantasy Points Network. And we will see you next week.